Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ongoing series with the Cyber Threat Alliance and our webcasts. I've got a great guest with me here today, Neill Sciarrone, a longtime friend and colleague in the cybersecurity policy universe. So I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and we'll turn it over to Neill to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Neill Sciarrone. As Michael mentioned, we had the privilege of working together in cyber many years ago, and I won't say exactly how many. And I've had the privilege of working in cyber across government, industry, and as an entrepreneur, starting my own company.
Great. Well, thanks for taking the time to join us virtually in our virtual studio and talk about cybersecurity. And taking that long view, right? And so some of what we're going to talk about today is based on that, that perspective that both of us have now, having worked in this area for quite some time. But I do think it's actually always interesting since when you and I got into cybersecurity, people didn't get cybersecurity degrees. You didn't, go to college saying, I want to be a cybersecurity nerd. How did you end up actually getting into cybersecurity?
Well, it's actually not at all what I expected to be doing. And so you can say it's fate. You could say it's by accident. I'll let you choose which of those two you want to interpret. The secret, Michael, is I've always been a real nerd that enjoyed science and math and technology. But quite frankly, that's not what I studied at college or in the university. I expected to be working in government somehow. Funny enough, I studied government and women's studies, how men and women communicate differently. I thought I was going to be helping female candidates run for office. And as you can see, I wound up really, really far from that in my career trajectory. But I happened to be in the right place at the right time. And so I had the privilege of working in the Department of Commerce in this tiny little office called the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office. Way back in the early days when Richard Clark and the President's Board were working on cyber issues. And then I was there for 9/11, right? So got to experience what it was, helping us figure out how to reorganize the government to address those issues. Actually, funny enough, as we talk about cyber, I was there for the stand-up of DHS, for the creation of the department. And most people forget that Title II of the Homeland Security Act actually included a whole section on cybersecurity and enhancing cybersecurity. It was the focus. So helped stand up DHS, and then had the privilege of going to the White House and working on critical infrastructure protection policy and cybersecurity policy and information sharing with law enforcement. And those seem like three really disconnected things, but in actuality, as you know, hugely connected. And so that's how I wound up really going in from a policy standpoint. And then falling in love with more of the technology and where this was going.
It's really cool. I mean, to somewhat of a, similar thing, I was working in the Office of Management and Budget, right, when we met. And in the mid 2000s, basically CIA, NSA, other national security elements started spending boatloads of money on this thing that was called cyber. Yep. And nobody knew what we were spending all this money on. And I remember very distinctly the OMB director looking at me and another guy and saying, you two, go get smart on this cyber thing, and that's how we, started down this path. But that was all as part of, as we started getting ready for the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, which,
CNCI?
The original CNCI. And so, I think it's actually interesting to think about, that's the mid 2000s, and it's well before most people think about, cyber sort of coming to the fore, right? It was actually fairly early on. And so why don't you give a little background on how the CNCI came about, sort of what the genesis of that was, and sort of how that came about?
Yeah. Funny enough, it's a while ago, and yet it seems like it was just the other day. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about a lot of the challenges being somewhat the same. But really, the genesis of it was, for the first time, the U.S. government faced a nation-state intrusion that we now kind of talk about but at the time, no one talked about, right? And we had the realization of needing to figure out, what are we going to do? And when you think about the CNCI, the initiative was really, okay, let's bring together all the various entities that had a role in cybersecurity. Because you're right, Michael, there were so many departments and agencies that played a role. They all had their own authorities. But we realized, okay, let's focus first on understanding what's happening. And as we used to use the phrase, sort of stop the bleeding, right? So let's figure out what we have going on. And then let's put in place a series of initiatives that help us get ahead of this problem to help ensure that we're not in this situation again. So how do we get ahead of the adversary, and how do we plan for the type of environment we want to really prevent this from occurring in the future? And so we did a couple things that were different in trying to go about solving this problem. And first, I'll give you huge credit. You know, you talked about OMB. Really, the unsung heroes in this challenge were you and your team. And it was about the numbers, right? And so we put together a policy, but more importantly, we aligned the money and the budget with that policy. And so, you know, one of my favorite memories is actually sitting around a table in OMB, in the EEOB, and going line by line and saying, okay, this is their budget request. Does this program facilitate the initiatives that we're trying to put forward? Yes or no, right? Does this help us move along? Where do we need to reprioritize the budget? And it's amazing when you align budget and policy, how much you can accomplish. You know, the other unique thing we did is we divided the conversation into two pieces. And so before we had a fight over who was going to do what, we agreed as an interagency body on what needed to be done. And so the interesting thing about that is everyone could agree on, for the most part, on the things that needed to occur, right? And when you took out the debate over who should do it, but what should be done, that became a much easier process.
Right.
The hard part then was when we had to assign people later on with the realization that you couldn't assign everyone. And I think that was an important challenge. When you make everyone and every department and agency responsible for something, then no one is responsible. It's that old, you know, military adage of having one person to point to when things go wrong.
Yeah.
But the nexus of it was really, how do we try to work and address these issues? And the funny thing is that it was done across departments and agencies. You know, we've talked, then it crossed administrations. And so in many ways, it was a bipartisan, across government effort to really figure out what needs to happen and how do we do it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that has really always struck me about this policy area is how you can pull on the threads and you can see the policy thread running from the Clinton administration through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, through this administration, right? That's in office now. And a lot of it looks very much the same. I mean, some of the words change, you know.
But fundamentally, I mean, you look at, in the Clinton administration, PDD 63, right? That is the basis, really, of starting all that we were working on. And to your point, you see that then pulled through, whether it's, you know, through the Bush administration with RPDs and trying to get to some of the key pieces of the initiative with CNCI, through the Obama administration, and then even now in the Trump administration under CISA. You see that line through. And I would say that that is good and bad, right? So the good piece is there's continuity and there is a longer view of what we need to do. I think that the negative is that there are some initiatives that you have to look at yourself and say, okay, if we've been trying to do this for this long and it hasn't succeeded, maybe we need to take a different approach to doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was thinking that about sort of, you know, what are some of those things that you see as sort of, you know, what are some of those things you see as being the same that we need to actually be rethinking? Because I certainly have a few. So
I do. I have a couple of things. One, I think it's interesting that we've spent so much time on this topic, and yet we still talk about cybersecurity, and no one's really clear what that means, right? You know, I talk all the time, is cybersecurity, is that Is that a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adjective? What does it mean? And it means different things to a lot of different people. And by not having a precise language around it, I think it's led to some confusion and some delays. The same thing is we also kind of have a bifurcation between what I'd refer to as the policy world and the technical world, right? And so oftentimes when people are talking about cybersecurity, they get technical really quickly. Yes. And I think you and I have both seen that at the leadership levels. The more technical you get, people back away, right? And leaders back away because they don't see necessarily these meaty, juicy policy issues that really exist. Or leadership issues from a business standpoint, right?
Right.
And so oftentimes it becomes this technical discussion when in reality, we need to be having a much more policy-based discussion, right? If this was a technical problem, as you say all the time, if this was technical, we would have solved it. Yeah. There's something else there that we really need to address. And so that piece is the same. We've made a lot of progress on the CNCI. I think the biggest challenge, and I'd love your view on it, we talk oftentimes the things we thought were going to be easy have actually proven to be the pieces that were hard. And I think the biggest challenge is, we're still talking about information sharing, and we're still talking about that piece as it relates to sharing amongst the government, and that piece as it relates to sharing with the private sector, and that piece as it relates to sharing internationally. And the fact that we're having that same conversation today that we had 18, 19 years ago, at the very early stages, it makes you wonder what we need to think about how to do that differently.
Yeah, and I think, Neill, when I think about information sharing, we have the same problem, right? People say information sharing, and it actually turns out that they mean a lot of different things, right?
Yeah.
And I run an organization, the Cyber Threat Alliance, that is dedicated to moving information among members. But, one of the things we've learned is that there's a lot of different types of information. And what the part of our problem has been that we've assumed, I think, that almost everyone should share all kinds of information all of the time, right? And that's just not the case. And, for 99% of the businesses in the United States, I could dump my database on them and they wouldn't have a clue what to do with the mound of malware samples and IP addresses and URLs and all the technical data that my members share.
Right.
And expecting most businesses to do that is actually, they're never going to have the technical capacity to do it. But even if somehow or another we could magically say everybody can have their own cybersecurity nerd, from an economic standpoint, that's not efficient, right? We don't that's why people outsource their taxes, right, to accountants. That's why they hire outside legal counsel. And so I think we need to get to a point where we really structure our discussion about information sharing to talk about okay, what information do you need as a business to better protect yourself in cyberspace? And for the most part, right, that's information about, is there some change in the environment that I need to be aware of, right? Is there a new vulnerability in a system that I use that I need to actually focus on? Is there a new threat actor who's targeting people like me, or organizations like me? Side note, I think it was very helpful for the Chinese to publish their China 2025 strategy because that allowed us to actually identify the major industries that they were targeting. So we appreciate that. That kind of information is what is useful, whereas a whole bunch of, internet protocol addresses or URLs is for the most part not useful unless you're a cybersecurity provider, right?
Yeah.
And so we really need to have a much more nuanced discussion about who's sharing what information for what purposes.
For what purposes and why? I having left government, running a really large P&L, and then starting my own business and focused solely on commercial markets, you learn the bigger question, which is, why do I care, right? And this goes back a little bit on the language of cyber. I mean, we have to learn to talk about cyber in a language of business, right? And so when you have a CIO show up board and they talk about really something very technical, that doesn't resonate. But when they show up in front of your board and talk about the inherent business risk that you're either mitigating or adding by your actions, or talk about how this investment impacts the business to achieve their financial goals for the quarter, then people listen, right? And to your point, it's getting to we're sharing threat information or sharing information. What specifically are you talking about? So back to the, cybersecurity or information means everything. We learned, Suzanne Spalding talks about this a lot. We learned that lesson in WMD, right? We kept talking about how do we protect against WMD? And until we were really specific and said, we're talking about, a weaponized biologic issue, until we were really specific, we couldn't address each piece. And I think to your point, are you talking about sharing information on indicators? Are you talking about sharing information, on the threat actor? Those are all different things. And then the question needs to be, why? So why do you, as a business owner or as an entity receiving it, need to care? What does it matter to you?
Right.
And then how are they doing it and what should you do about it? So oftentimes we send out information with this, here it is. And you do okay, that's great. What do you want me to do about it? So making some, it's that next step. Why do you care? And what do you need to do?
Yeah. I mean, and just sort of, we're past the point where we need to tell people, be afraid, be very afraid. Like we got that, right? It's, we've achieved awareness. Right now we need to, be focused on, as you were saying, that what do we actually do about it, right? And I think about this is an interesting question to me of sort of, we often don't work backwards from, okay, so what would a world where we've actually managed our cybersecurity risk, because we'll never, get rid of cybersecurity threats entirely. So what would a world where we've managed our cybersecurity threats effectively, what would that look like? What characteristics would it have? And how do we then start to work backwards from that to put those characteristics into place? And I'm sort of curious if you've thought any about like what some of those characteristics would be.
Yeah, I think there's two characteristics, but first I really want to pull on your statement. I think you're really onto something here. And I wish this is one of the lessons that cross the national security community, right? So both DoD and the intelligence community plans. You have, Global Trends 2020 that was done. You look 10 years ahead. You think through what is the landscape going to be, and then what does that mean from a capability and deterrence perspective that you build against that. And to your point, I don't think we do that often enough or comprehensive enough in a cyber environment to say, what is this going to look like? I will say, I think fundamentally what the internet looks like today is going to be different, right? You're already seeing from a Russian standpoint, the disengagement. But to answer your specific question about, being able to manage it, I would like to see two trends. And I think two trends would come out as part of being able to manage. The first being an approach that focuses on flexible and agile solutions. And I say that by meaning we tend to approach cybersecurity today as a compliance activity, right? To the point of a checklist. You need one of these, right, 4 of these, 6 of these, and then you're, compliant. And we haven't said, we want you to achieve the following thing, and that there are multiple ways to achieve it. And by sort of taking this one-size-fits-all approach, we've ignored the fact that each industry and each business is unique and that it's not a monolith. Now, granted, there are things that are consistent and you can learn from others, but this, if everyone has this thing and this thing, we're suddenly secure, to me is just, it's not practical, and it doesn't let you grow and change and adjust as your technology environment adjusts and as your business environment adjusts, right?
Yeah.
The second, and that agility is also around, how we set policies. Oftentimes, our policy structure is so slow in moving forward that by the time something is put in place, the technology has already exceeded what we were debating to begin with. And so it's that agile, flexible approach is what I think we will have achieved when we're managing it. The second piece is I think we'll have taken the lessons that we, again, see in the national security community of not forgetting that this isn't just about technology, it's about people.
Yeah.
And what I don't mean here is the traditional cyber approach where we say, well, it's a people problem, it's a user problem.
Right.
To me, that's
problem
not what
between keyboard and chair,
Right. That's it. And, there are still education needs, but that's not what I mean here. What I mean is that there's an adversary on the other end that is a person that has goals, that has an objective. And so to me, it would be taking that piece and understanding what are they trying to achieve, right? Who is the adversary? Yep. Who is doing the attacking? Because this isn't contrary to some of the futuristic books and movies. We're not there where it's computer on computer without a human having set it in process. So there is a human with a goal behind it. And I think incorporating that into our efforts will be the key to managing it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is very important in that area is that we tend to think of achieving good cybersecurity as keeping the bad guy out. Now, one can argue about whether or not there was ever actually a contained network to keep them out of. But if there ever was, there certainly isn't anymore, right? With the way that technology has sort of blurred those network edges or whatever. But what I would argue is that's the wrong mindset. To your point, there's an adversary and they've got a goal, right? If it's a criminal, they're out to make money. If it's a nation state, they're out to either cause disruption or steal information or, but they've got a goal of some kind. And if you think about cybersecurity as preventing the adversary from achieving their goal,
it's a different discussion.
That's an entirely different discussion. And suddenly you don't have to be right every single time. They have to be right every single time.
Yes.
Right. I mean, and if we sort of think about it, if I stop them anywhere short of them attaining their goal, they lose. Right. And then suddenly that's a very different picture.
Right. And it turns the math, right? We've spent all this time protecting the tons of endpoints that are just going to multiply. And the math works against you. But there's a limited number of adversaries. So when you flip that equation, it's a different way to think about it. Now, it's not as exciting, right?
Right.
I joke with people all the time. I'm like, I'm not, cybersecurity world, when you're making real difference, it's not sitting there with the cloaky, hoodie and your Mountain Dew on a keyboard, actively going after someone.
Right.
Unfortunately, the aspects of cyber that make a lot of the real progress are, to your point, it's sitting there and going line by line to make sure your policy and your money and your activities line up to address it. And that's not the exciting piece, but it's the needed piece.
Yeah. A lot of times it's the boring stuff that actually really makes the difference, and I joke too when I do speeches and things that, it always amuses me to watch Hollywood movies with hackers because no hack ever takes longer than a 30-second pan shot, and yes, there are times when it's easy to get in places, but it's not that easy. And it requires time and investment. And so a lot of what we need to do is think about how we impose additional time, impose additional costs on the adversaries. And I think if we can start to do that, then we will have, then we'll actually have made this change and this shift. And so what I find fascinating about our conversation, so far this morning is we've actually not mentioned one single actual piece of technology. Right. In all of this. I mean, and I think that it's not that the technology is unimportant, right? It's a critically important part of this. It's all dependent on the technology. But the real shift we need to make is not in our technology. It's actually in our relationship to the technology. And it's how people are actually using the technology. And changing how we think about the technology. And so to me, that's the part of the reason that there has been, this continuity is because the policy issues are going to remain in many ways the same. right? No matter how you look at it. But what we need to do differently in order to make progress is change how we think about the problem, and come at it from a different mindset. And, I think, so one of the other areas I wanted to touch on with you is just, I want to go back to the language issue and talk a little bit about, even how the language that we use in cybersecurity, it tends to take us down a certain path, right? And it tends to take us down that very technical path, as you mentioned. It also tends to take us down a path that is largely, to be perfectly blunt, people who look like me, right?
Yes.
Gen X white guys. And I think that narrowness of perspective also actually constrains us. And we actually need to broaden our thinking by not only changing our mindset, but bringing in a lot more different perspectives into cybersecurity. And I was curious what you sort of thought about, some of that. And I know you've got some funny stories on that score.
I have a lot of funny stories on that score, and we only have a half an hour. Although I will say being named Neill has been very beneficial for me in cyber, since most people assume I'm a guy, and they find it really shocking when they meet me in person. I would say that the diversity is important, and it's not only diversity of just, who we are. And so I'm always quick to point out there are a lot of women in cybersecurity, and there are great places to source talent. And so whether it's, going to the Women in Technology organization or Women in Cyber, CyberWire does a great thing about women in cyber. We are all out there. There is talent that you can find if you're willing to look for it. And I think it helps your team. The other piece I would add is, you and I have backgrounds that are not traditional in cybersecurity. And I think it's important on your team. You have to have the technology experts, but you have to have folks who view problems differently. And that's bringing in the folks that are non-engineers and non-computer science to also assist with the issue. And I think by creating a really diverse group of folks focused on the problem, you help solve it better.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, I think that's very true. We've only got a couple of minutes left in this particular episode. So, if there's something that you really wanted to get out there that you wanted anybody who's watching this to pick up on, what would that message be?
I think it's that there's still a lot to be done. And I think we really need to spend time challenging our approach, but doing so in a way that looks at solving the problem instead of studying the problem, right? There tends to be a lot of focus on the what was wrong and not as much focus on the what should we do. And I think you and I benefited from a team that across the board, some amazing people in different federal departments and agencies that have gone on to different roles that were all focused on the do, right? And so I think that's important. You made a really important statement about looking at the problem differently. And so reflecting on what we've learned, but freeing ourselves from that approach. And then the last thing I think that you and I in our friendship over the years has proven is that this also has to be done in a bipartisan way. And one of the cool things about our relationship and the folks that we've worked with across both administrations is we listen. And so we're willing to challenge each other and then listen to the other point of view. And I think one of the sad things today is there's not a lot of listening going on in politics and not a lot of willingness to work across party. And so the fact that you have a topic that has a history of doing that, to me, I think this is one of the areas where we could start and figure out how do we make a real difference. It's a problem that's not going away. No. It will be a challenge. But there really is a basis for cooperation, collaboration, and a bipartisan approach to something that's really important.
No, I completely agree. And, definitely more listening would be good. And it's something that I very much appreciate about, being able to have good friends that will, as you say, challenge you, but also then will listen. So, well, I very much appreciate you taking the time to join me in this discussion. It's really cool to connect and to talk across, such a long span of time, but also realize that, we have made some progress, and as you said, there's still more to be done. But I think that we can actually build on what we have learned, as you said, because we now do have a lot of lessons to draw upon, and we can use that as the basis for going forward. So, thanks for joining me today, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon. All right, thanks everyone.